The scream cut the dusk like a sudden blade. It came from somewhere beyond the curve of the arroyo, thin and high and full of a human panic that made Zeca drop the bundle of twine he had been carrying. He had been 2 days from the village, boots still muddied from the cattle route, the smell of gunpowder and spent coffee on his jacket. The sun was a flat coin sinking behind the ridge. The world smelled of dust and ember. For a long instant, there was nothing but the late heat and the steady, familiar rhythm of his own breathing. Then the scream again, closer, and another sound under it, a low, wet growl that did not belong to the fields. Zeca ran toward the sound without thinking. He had grown up with small acts of bravery that required no thought. Hauling seed in the rain, pulling an animal from a fence, leading a frightened foal down a lane. This was louder, rawer. The dog at his heel, Trovão, answered with a bay that sounded like a warning and a plea. They reached the stand of young trees at the edge of the path and stopped where the dirt dropped away into the hollow. Between a clump of brush and a thread of moonlight, a shape crouched. A great cat coiled like a living shadow, muscles tense, yellow eyes catching the last of the light. Near its paws a woman was crumpled on the ground, her arm bent at an odd angle, dark spread on her sleeve. She had a woven skirt gathered around her knees and hair braided at the nape of her neck. She kept her chin lifted as if to meet the animal's stare rather than beg for mercy. The jaguar's whiskers trembled. It did not look away. Zeca's fingers found the stock of his gun as if they belonged there. He had never been a showman with a weapon. He carried the old gun because fences broke and coyotes came for the hens. But he knew how the forest listened for the crack of a shot. He could have taken aim. He could have crept up and tried to make a smarter plan. Instead, something older than strategy did the unthinkable. He hefted the gun and fired straight into the sky. The thunder of the shot split the air, white and absolute. The jaguar blinked, ears flattening against its head, and then it leapt back as if the world had betrayed it. It didn't bolt so much as fold away into the trees, a bruise of fur and golden eyes that receded like a bad dream. The woman curled inward and made no sound that Zeca could hear, just breathed with all the length of her ribs. Trovão loped forward and nosed at her hand, whimpering low. Zeca did not assess his deed in words. He only felt the rawness of his chest and the way his hands shook. He moved toward the woman with the urgency of someone who had dodged a blade and now had to answer for the tremor of his own body. Up close, he saw the blood on her sleeve, the tear in the fabric where an animal's claw had cut cheap linen. Her eyes were dark and steady. They did not plead. They measured. "You're hurt," he said, because what else does a man say in the presence of danger that has run out of teeth? "I am," she said. Her voice was plain, and in it there was the sound of a person who named things exactly. She did not say thank you. Instead she spoke words that sounded to Zeca at once blunt and ancient. "You have taken my life's danger from me. In my people's law, that makes a debt." It was like dropping a new kind of rock into his chest. He blinked, surprised by how foreign the concept felt, though not the thing itself. Debts of honor and reciprocity lived everywhere in their valley. He had mended fences for neighbors, and neighbors had mended his roof. But the word she used was different in tone. Not neighbor, not friend, it was law. "You are mine now," she said. The phrase landed between them as a fact, not an accusation. It was not possessive in the way he feared. There was no bell of ownership in it. It carried the weight of custom, an acknowledgement that a life taken from peril could not simply be lost in silence. Zeca's jaw moved as he tried to find a response. He was a man who preferred wood to words, who had learned to speak with a hammer and a pair of hands more than with promises. Up the path he could already see the smoke from the nearest houses, neighbors watching from their doorways as their day tilted into night. He had no plan for how to manage an obligation rooted in a culture he did not fully know. He also had no plan for a woman at his doorstep with blood on her arm. "Come sit on my porch," he said finally. "We'll get it looked at." They moved like two animals measuring the creak of a new arrangement. The porch light was a trembling kerosene lamp. The chair creaked under the woman as she eased herself into it, and Trovão curled at her feet and watched Zeca as if he were a judge. Zeca boiled water in the old iron kettle until the room smelled of hot metal and river stones. He found a strip of linen and rinsed it, dipping it in the brewed water. He mouthed apologies while he worked. apologies for the intrusion of sickness, and for his clumsy hands. The woman watched him with an economy of patience. When he peeled back the torn sleeve, the wound was ugly but not mortal. A ragged streak across the forearm where claws had run through skin and muscle. Blood had darkened the cloth. The smell of animal fur and wet earth clung to her. Zeca thought of stitches and the long haul of fever. His mind scrolled the practical lists he had kept his life by. He had healing things in a battered tin, saline, a spool of thread, a shard of metal for sutures. But he also had, sitting on the pantry shelf in a brown jar, a handful of guaco leaves his mother had dried one spring because a traveling healer from the river had said they eased the ache of bites and infections. He had not needed them in years. He fed the woman the bitter steep of guaco, watching the lines around her mouth soften with the first warm sip. Then he washed the wound and laid down a poultice of crushed leaves mixed with ash. Old remedies, not miracles. The poultice cooled the raw edges, and the steam of the herb rose in little ghosts as they worked. She did not close her eyes in gratitude. She simply accepted the care with the economy of someone who had survived on practical help before. "You could go home," Zeca said eventually, because the hour asked for decisions. "Your people, your village, they'll find you if you head back." She looked at him then, and for the first time something like an amused weight touched her face. "If I went home bleeding and broken and said that a stranger shot a jaguar for me, would they believe I had earned nothing by it?" Her voice had warmth now, but there was steel underneath. "No, the law will want balance. I have told you what it is. There are terms to be kept." "Terms," Zeca repeated, tasting the foreignness of the sound. What did terms look like? Chains? Servitude? He felt the old fear of being bound by a promise he had not meant to make. He did not like being told he had to be responsible for something beyond his fences. She folded the bandage over the wound and tightened it with practiced fingers. Not chains. Shelter. Work. One cycle of days to mend what was broken. After that, the debt is returned. Zeca made a face that was both bewilderment and relief. 1 month, then? It felt like a length of time both small and vast. Vaster, because he had never imagined his solitude punctured by another life that might stay. He agreed before he could overthink. All right, 1 month. That was the first unthinkable thing. The second unthinkable thing would come weeks later, when obligations and choices braided until Zeca could not tell what had been duty and what had been desire. If you love true stories of courage and unlikely love, hit like and subscribe. Stay with this one. There's more ahead. The days settled into work like a familiar tool. The porch became a center of small economies. The kettle sang every morning. A chipped tin cup always waited on the rail. Trovão took up a post between them, alternately guarding and snoozing. Zeca was more awkward than the barn tools he tended, but he learned to boil water without making the house smell like smoke, to fan the coals just right. Yara, her name was a slow stream of syllables that fit the contours of her face, moved with the surety of someone who had always been on the land in a different register. She mended nets with a thumb that worked the knot without looking, and she taught Zeca the angles of setting a trap so that it would catch and not maim. She had come carrying knowledge in her pockets. Which route would staunch bleeding, where to find clean water after the first rain, how to read the wind by the way the grass bowed. Zeca offered up his skills as if they were trinkets. How to gauge the fence posts for rot, how to make a simple sling to carry the newborn lamb if the need arose, which knots would not slip when loaded. They traded instruction like the exchange of currency, one skill in return for another, and with each exchange the awkwardness receded a little. They spoke in lean sentences at first, then the speech loosened where it needed to. Yara told small stories about her father, Zeca, who walked the village like a careful shadow and smelled faintly of smoke and juniper. She spoke of the river beyond the hills and of the way the women danced at the moon festivals. She spoke without mythologizing what she was, but with the plain pride of someone rooted in a place. Zeca told of his mother's famous biscuits that burned on the edges but always made you want to come home, of a boy in church who missed prayers because he was learning how to shoe horses. He was not a man of many words, but his stories had a steady rhythm that pleased her. In the mornings they moved as if to rehearsed steps. Milk the cow, check the fence, set a line for fish. Yara watched Zeca with a mixture of amusement and approval as he tried to learn how to coax milk without pinching the teat, and she would press the heel of her hand against his forearm and say, "Like this," then demonstrate. When he made mistakes, she laughed softly rather than scold, and the laughter was a kind of thread that began to stitch them together. They took pride in the petty victories, fixing a broken gate, catching a fish without the line snapping, making a bread that rose instead of folding in on itself. Even so, the days were not all ease. Zeca's world was made of lonely rhythms. He had cultivated his self-reliance as one cultivates dry land. Iara's coming into that orbit nudged old habits into new shapes, and sometimes the shapes scraped against one another. There were moments when Zeca would clear his throat and say something clumsy about obligations, and Iara would answer as if naming a calendar. "You offered me a roof. We agreed to a month." He would bristle and then relent, recognizing the law as something she carried like a staff, authoritative, not ornamental. Night was its own country. When the sun had fallen and the lamp burned low, the house exhaled, and the wild made its presence felt. Trovão would put his head on Yara's lap and look up as if he had a finger on the pulse of the dark. Sometimes the wind would carry a sound from the trees like the breath of a beast, and both of them would listen in the way people listen for thunder. Once, in the quiet between coffee and sleep, Yara hummed a short tune. No words, a thread of melody as simple as a pebble dropped in a pond. Zeca found himself humming back, not because he knew the tune, but because his chest had found a place to echo. As the days stacked into weeks, their hands learned the grammar of each other's needs. Iara taught him how to make a poultice for swollen ankles and how to pick out the kind of grass that would keep the hens from sulking. Zeca showed Iara the best place to rest a trap when the coyotes began to circle the edges of the fields, and how to oil a hinge so it would stop its long complaining creak. They set the rhythm of a household, each small chore folded into the next like a practiced dance. The porch, which had been Zeca's solitary island, began to carry 2 cups at morning, 2 steaming tins at dusk. Trovão grew into a patient mediator between them, a warm, steady presence with a tail that seemed to keep time. There was tenderness in small, unremarkable things. The way Iara would take off her boots and hand them to Zeca when his hands were sticky with dough. The way Zeca once wrapped a spare blanket around her shoulders because the night had crept colder than either had expected. Each act of care built toward a complicated architecture that neither of them labeled as love at first. It was love as grain becomes bread, slow, inevitable, the result of patient transformation. Throughout these domestic seasons, the Jaguar's presence threaded through like a warning. When the moon was thin, there was an unfamiliar hush, as if the trees had leaned in to listen. From the tree line would come that low growl again, a sound that put the pulse at the surface of the blood. Once, on a walk to fetch water, they saw prints pressed into the mud, great ovals with the visible drag of claws. The sight tightened something in Zeca's chest, in a way the wound on Yara's arm had not. It was one thing to know about danger abstractly. It was another to see the size of the animal that had tried to take a life. Iara did not seem surprised by the returns of the predator. "They test boundaries," she said one dusk, while they sat under a lamplight and listened to the night. "They see where their teeth can reach. An old jaguar remembers a wound like a map." "You want to go back to your village?" Zeca asked. The question was more tender than accusatory. It was curiosity about whether the law had begun to yank them back toward the place it had come from. "I have my people," she said. "But there is a place where I have learned the taste of bread warm from the oven and a man who fixes hinges. The law binds us for balance. It doesn't say where a person must stand when the balance is kept." She looked at him with an expression that made him prickly and very small and very warm all at once. The nights of waiting tightened toward a shape. The jaguar's calls came more often. The animal prowled the edges of the fields, testing the fences with scent and the sky with its eyes. The village murmured. Neighbors exchanged looks at the market, and Cacique Aron came by more than once to see how his daughter fared. He was a large man with hands that had split the bark of many trees, and a voice like gravel rolled in the mouth. He did not come with anger. He came with concern and the duty of a father, and he watched the pair on the porch with his head tilted as if memorizing them. "That animal doesn't take unless it must," Aron said, one evening when Zeca and Iara and Trovão sat beneath a sky that had bruised to a dark violet. "But it has claimed the field's shadow. You've bought time with a gunshot, Zeca. Now you must teach the land to hold you." Zeca nodded, though he still felt unworthy of the big man's appraisal. He had no great plan beyond the thing his hands always did when the roof leaked or the fence fell. He worked. He sharpened his blades, dug posts deeper, built a more secure pen for the livestock. Iara taught the children of the village later how to make cord from the local grass and how to watch for the animals' tracks. This was not matchmaking so much as shared defense, people learning to live with what the wild offered and took. The night the Jaguar returned was bright with moon and a silence like a held breath. Crickets kept a thin rhythm, and somewhere a pig squealed and then was quiet. Zeca slept in the doorway with the shotgun propped against the wall, his head heavy with a fatigue that ached like an old rope. Iara slept in the back room on a pallet. Her bandaged arm had healed into an elegant puckered line. They'd grown into the easy, wordless comfort that hints at deep trust. Trovão lay on his back, legs in the air, dreaming of the field. It was Trovão who started at the first sound, the little rip of leaves, the crack of a twig. He was up and alert like a spring, ears pricked and body taut. Zeca woke with his hand on the wooden grip of the gun. He could hear the animal now, a careful step, the taste of thirst in the night. The Jaguar moved like a thought that would not stop forming. When it stepped into the moonlight they saw it, all muscle and cosmic eyes, fur like soaked dusk. It glared at the pen with a deliberate insolence, then turned its head and fixed Iara and Zeca in one glance, as if it remembered them. Iara was already moving. She had an arrow nocked in her bow, black hair braided tight against her skull, and a face set to a purpose that had the clarity of river ice. Zeca lifted his gun and felt his old reflexes take over. Breath, aim, the small internal counting that led to choosing to let a bullet find its mark. They did not speak. There would be no talk in that kind of fight. They had no illusions that blood would be clean or easy. It was a matter of defense, of keeping the people and beasts they kept alive. The Jaguar stepped forward as if measuring the light. Iara released an arrow with a sound like the crack of a whip. It struck the thick of the animal's shoulder with a sludgy impact that made it roar, low and outraged. Zeca fired a second later. The bullet found the predictable give of muscle, and the animal tumbled with a roar that shook the leaves. It was not a theatrical fall, only a tired one, an animal finally unable to reconcile hunger and age and the sudden intervention of human hands. They had moments that followed the violence as delicate as any ritual. It would have been easy to stand and shout and celebrate, but both of them understood how fragile the line between life and blame could be. They moved toward the fallen beast with respect, not triumph. Iara touched its flank with a hand that trembled at the thought of what they'd done, and then steadied with the practical, almost ceremonial knowledge of a people who had survived by understanding when to take and when to spare. They cleared the animal from the fence, bound its paws, and together they hauled it into the barn. Zeca's muscles remembered how to lift and carry things, the animal's weight, the smell of it, the rawness of being alive and then not. He felt something loosen in his chest, like breath finding a way out of a held fist. They treated the Jaguar with a certain dignity. They wrapped its head and laid a cloth over its eyes. They used the pelt as a reminder of a night that had changed them. They did not make trophies of it. They used what needed to be used, leather for the mend of a harness, meat to be shared and dried for the dogs. There was no excess. The animal's life had given something. A warning had become a lesson. A threat had become a boundary. After the killing, the language between Zeca and Iara altered. There was a new evenness to their shared tasks. No longer did he feel the awkwardness of a debtor, or she the coolness of a creditor. The obligations of the law had been balanced into practical closure. What remained was something neither of them had predicted. They sat on the porch in a silence that hummed like a settled wire. Trovão lay with his head under Iara's hand, and the lamplight threw warm circles over the three of them. "I could go back," Iara said finally, not as a question but as the admission of possibility. The words landed between them like seeds. Zeca turned to her, the fear that had always sat in the corner of his chest, fear of losing his solitude, fear of belonging, wore away in the face of what he had learned to like about this life. He liked the way she hummed over the stew, how she never flinched when the animals were skittish, how she spoke of her father with a quiet pride. He liked absurdly that she called him by the diminutive no one else used, and that his hands had learned something like tenderness toward another skin. "I don't want you to go," he heard himself say, the sound surprising in its softness. Saying it was different from meaning it, there was a trembling bareness to confessing that you had come to want a person to stay. It felt like exposing a plank of unpainted wood to the weather. He waited for her to resent him for the admission, to recoil at the thought that his words might sound like possession. Instead, she reached and took his hand with a surety that made his pulse tilt. "Stay," she said, "not because the law binds you. Stay because this is where you want to be." There are confessions that are small and awkward, sometimes a gesture, sometimes a slow tilt of the head. The thing that passed between them then was neither ceremonial nor dramatic. It was the bare clarity of two people who had seen their own worst, who had faced the rawness of danger together, and in doing so learned to notice the fragile truth of each other. When they told Cacique Aron of their wish, because customs mattered, and because words of union should be said openly, the old man did not clap his hands or pace like a kid. He sat and listened with the weathered patience of someone who had seen seasons change more times than there were roofs in his village. He asked questions. He wanted to know whether Iara's desire to remain had been chosen freely. She answered him the way a person of agency does, clearly, in terms that left no doubt. "I came to his house hurt," she said. "He saved my life. I accepted his shelter for a month. In that month I learned to like the sound of his laugh and the way he takes tea with a scowl. I do not stay because I must. I stay because I wish to." Aron's face, which had held every kind of weather, creased in something like a smile. He placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, a gesture that passed the blessing of a father without ceremony. "Then he is a man who knows how to keep a home," he said, "and you are a woman who knows how to keep a path." There was another kind of ritual that mattered to Zeca. The priest from the town, a small man with spectacles and a gentle voice who had come at Aron's request. He arrived as a bridge, a voice that would help make plain to the village that this was not theft of custom but a joining of families. He was careful in his speech, respectful in his tone, and in the way priests sometimes do, he named things in a way that made them sound both formal and tender. The wedding was a weave of two traditions. There was smoke from a bowl where Yara's sisters scattered herbs and offered a breath to the earth. There was a short prayer by the priest that spoke of bread and shelter, of keeping and tending. Neighbors came from houses with lamps in their hands. The clink of crockery and the low hum of conversation filled the air. Children darted between legs, and Trovão kept a dignified vigil at the couple's feet. The music at the celebration took both the drum and the harmonica, the old and the borrowed. People danced under a lantern-light sky that smelled of burned sugar and the river. There was no spectacle of ownership, only community, a mutual recognition that two people had decided to bind their lives together. In the early years that followed, the farm stretched like a story being told into a new chapter. Zeca's fields prospered in small, honest ways. The cows calved with less fuss. The seed that they planted in the spring took and turned to grain. Yara's knowledge of herbs made their household robust. A poultice for a bite, a tonic to steady the stomach. Nothing miraculous, but the sort of medicine that kept people working and laughing. They built a little school in a spare shed where children learned to read the sky and the math of sowing seasons. Zeca and Yara taught side by side, he with calloused palms that could write a straight line now, she with the patient cadence of the stories that made the past useful to the present. There were hard seasons, drought that tightened the throat of the earth, a fever that made the nights long and taut. But even in those times the farm felt like a place of true belonging. They showed each other their worst and their best. They argued over nothing, whether the fence should be painted red or left the color of dry birch, whose turn it was to wake and watch the milk come in the cold hours. They reconciled with the small ritual of a shared cup of bitter coffee and a laugh that made the edges soften. Children came as a surprise and a given the way children do. One moment there was a hunger for another voice in the house. The next there were tiny boots on the porch and a laugh like a bell. Zeca's shoulders broadened again, not because he had worked harder, but because something in him stretched to hold the new life. Yara's face softened into the rounding of motherhood in a way that was not to be described as surrender, but as another form of agency. She organized the household, taught the children herbal songs, and watched with fierce pride as they learned the village's stories. Trovão grew old at the edge of his life, with gray in his muzzle and a careful, pleased look in his eyes when the children ran. He died at last in the sun near the barn, a final sleep that left a hollow in the mornings. They buried him under the fig tree that shaded the yard and planted a small stone with scratchings the children had made. They remembered him forever in the dog benches and in the way the household rhythm would never quite move without the memory of his flopping tail. The jaguar's pelt hung for a long time in the barn loft, not as ornamentation but as a reminder. The night that had tested them and the boundary they had set. It was a sober thing to pass hands over that fur and remember how it had breathed and how it had stopped. The pelt served practical things, patched harnesses, a strip of leather for a baby boot. With time, its presence at the loft became as ordinary as bread on the table, a quiet testament to a moment that had shifted the axis of a life. The village and the town grew into one another in small ways. The priest became a familiar figure who would sometimes sit with them at supper and listen to stories about the river. Cacique-Aron's children showed up to teach weaving in the low shed, where sewing circles formed like small islands. The old customs were honored, the law that once demanded balance had been observed, and then the balance had been made into choice. People found ways to accept the blending of families because the couple had shown, day after day, that the bond had not been about possession, but about two people who chose each other. Years stacked themselves gently. The children learned to walk where the Jaguar had padded. They toddled across the yard where once a woman had bled and then become a neighbor. Zeca planted a row of fruit trees that in later summers would become a shade too generous for one house. They built a porch extension, and in that extra space hung a simple swing with hand-carved sides that Zeca insisted on finishing himself. Yara hung her herbs to dry above the stove and taught the neighbor women the names and uses of each leaf, every one of which she described with the same plain clarity she had carried when she first came to the porch. Sometimes, on the evenings when the air was honeyed and the children played chase among the hay bales, Zeca would go out to the top of the hill and watch the sun drop. He would see in the streaked sky the place where he had heard the scream that had split his life into before and after. He would think of his younger self, of a man who valued his quiet like a shield, and would not feel shame for what he had become. He had risked his body once for a life that had not been his, and had risked his solitude later for the possibility of belonging. Both acts were unthinkable in their own ways. The first had been physical, the old reflex of a man who knew how to outrun danger. The second had involved a surrender that felt more dangerous than any wild animal. Yara would come and stand beside him, not touching first but close enough that they could both look out at the valley. She would hum that same small tune, and the sound would fit into the air like a good word in a long sentence. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they let the children's laughter be the speech. She wore her hair different now, some braids loose, some tucked. Yet when she bent to pick a child from the hay bale, Zeca would see again the young woman who had spoken of law and choice on his porch. He would feel gratitude, which was not a repayment, but a recognition that their lives sat together like two hands cupped around the same flame. They grew old together in small, relentless ways. The lines at the corner of Zeca's eyes became trenches that told of laughter and of worry in equal measure. Yara's hands carried the neat ink of years of tending herbs and children's garments. They argued less about paint colors and more about whether the old doghouse should be left or replaced. The children grew up with the stories of the Jaguar at their feet, not as a horror tale, but as a lesson about how the world can change when people decide to bind their lives rather than their debts. The final image of that arc mirrored the first but had the weight of many small winters in it. They stood on the porch at sunset, older and steadier. The children chased one another in the golden field, their voices mixed with the distant calling of a hawk. The house was fuller, the farm more productive, and the community had woven itself into a pattern that held. There was a patch of moonlight on the fence where years earlier the Jaguar had first been seen. Now the moonlight lay over a family that had learned to live in the kind of fierce tenderness that comes after nights of fear and days of shared chores. Zeca placed a hand on Yara's shoulder, feeling the map of her bones through the fabric, and she leaned into him like a person who knew where she would stand. He thought of the gunshot that had split the world open and the way his life had turned. First a single physical leap into danger, then the greater leap of unlearning solitude and learning to be required by another heart. Both acts were the unthinkable because they moved him away from the safety he had cultivated into the wildness of belonging. They had not taken what tradition might have feared. No one had owned another. No custom had been perverted into coercion. Instead, what had begun as a law and a debt had been transmuted into a choice. The debt had been paid in the practical way laws often ask, with shelter and work and the ritual of writing a life. The rest belonged to human tending, time, patience, the willingness to share the mundane edges of life until they gleamed like polished wood. At dusk, when the light flattened into the color of ember, Zeca and Yara watched as the valley breathed. Somewhere a rooster crowed lazy and late. The pelt in the loft looked down at them like a memory. The dog's stone under the fig tree glinted in the last light. They had a life stitched from the thread of danger and the thread of steady days, and both threads were necessary. It was the kind of life that seemed at once ordinary and miraculous for that reason. The miracle of two hands that choose to hold one another through the dull, repetitive work of being alive. If this story moved you, by the courage shown in the rescue, the fight beside the fence, or the way two worlds learn to live as one, leave a comment telling us which moment touched you most. Subscribe for more stories that show how small acts of bravery can reshape a life.